Currently, we are a few weeks away from March Madness, and there are a couple of schools that usually make noise in the month of March that don't exactly have football programs. That's why I feel like it's honestly a perfect time to talk about this subject, as in today's video we're going to do that. We're going to talk about, in my opinion, 8 high-profile schools that don't have football. We're also going to talk about why they don't have football, and if there's any sort of future in them with the sport. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you're going to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about big-time schools that do not have football. Okay, so the first school I want to talk about is the DePaul Blue Demons, which are located in Chicago. DePaul had a club football team for one season back in 2015, but hasn't fielded a scholarship football team since 1939. After being formed in 1907, when St. Vincent's College, D-Men, and Chicago changed their name to the Blue Demons, they were actually independents during their entire existence from 1901 to 1939. They switched their home fields around a few times, sometimes in the middle of the year, going from places like Wrigley Field to Soldier Field to Loyola Field and sometimes smaller stadiums just outside the city. Despite being in a place like Chicago, the Blue Demons weren't hugely successful in football, as during their 38-year run, the team never really saw much success. In 1932, the team went 5-1-2, and in 1933, the team went 6-0-1, but didn't make a bowl game. They also won 5 games in 1935, 7 in 1936, and 2-7 in their final year in 1938. But it turns out that'd be the final season of Blue Demons football. As a whole, decided to leave football altogether, being one of a handful of schools to decide to do that before the United States' entry into World War II. That reason, according to the president of the university, was because of a lack of sufficient interest to justify the cost of the football program. Keeping students on the team and fans in the seats had started to become a problem, especially without an on-campus stadium. There would be a few pushes later for club football at the school, and they would have one in 2015. But that team also ended up folding later the same year because students were literally just not interested in keeping it going. Okay, so one of the most famous schools without football was Wichita State. Currently, they're in the American Athletic Conference for all sports except that. They are one of the most forward-minded football teams in the Midwest for quite some time, with the first ever football game being played under the lights in the early 1900s, the first black D1 head football coach in the 70s, and they are one of the last official Missouri Valley football schools before the conference dropped it altogether in 1985. But they would end up dropping their football season after the 1986 season. The misconception is that Wichita State ended their football program because of a deadly plane crash that took the lives of 31 players, coaches, and staff members. But this actually isn't true because the crash was in 1970 and the football team lived 16 years after that. The real reason was the Wichita State program wasn't very good and was struggling to keep fans in the seats, as they were just 375, 402, and 47 overall as a program. Without many fans in the seats, and most of the teams in their conference being 1A or FCS, Wichita State and Tulsa were the only FBS teams in the MWC. Once the Missouri Valley Conference decided to disband their football together, the cost of running a program got too high, and the Shockers chose to put all their money into other sports like baseball and basketball. With the rise of their other programs, though, restarting a football program has gotten more and more expensive. Joining the American made that even more difficult, since the Shockers would probably only have a few years to build up the roster and play as an FCS team before they would immediately jump to the top of the group of 5. Honestly, it's just way too expensive for them to restart the team. The third school I want to talk about is the Gonzaga Bulldogs. They ended up pulling their plug on their football team a long time ago. Their first season was in 1892, and their final season was 1941. They were independents for most of their existence, except in 1924 and 1925, when they were part of the Northwest Conference with the big Oregon and Washington schools, plus Montana and Idaho. When the big schools left for what would eventually become the Pac-12, Gonzaga went back to being independent. All time, they were 134, 99, and 20, with an 0-1 record in bowl games. As their only bowl game came in a loss to West Virginia in the San Diego East-West Classic. The Mountaineers would claim a national title that season, meaning that at 5-3, Gonzaga technically played in a national championship game if you squint. But the rise of World War II meant that the travel costs for certain universities were starting to become difficult to maintain, and the football team had already started to slow down considerably. By the time America entered into the war in December of 1941, the Bulldog program was already halted. Gonzaga put a pause to all their sports teams, and when that pause was lifted after the war, football just never came back. Football was just too expensive to maintain, and instead of bringing it back, they just decided they'd be better off if football wasn't a part of it. They had some really great players during their time though, like Houston Stockton, the grandfather of John Stockton. They haven't put much thought into football since then, and even though they joined the Pac-12 as a non-football member in 2026, the athletics department hasn't thought too much about restarting a team, and basketball has become a super brand. The Bulldogs ended up blowing up in the 90s, and Mark Few is a legendary coach, and they are truly one of the biggest brands in college basketball, so I don't think they really have to worry about football, to be honest. Okay, so the next school to talk about is the Creighton Blue Jays. They're in the same boat as Gonzaga as a school that dropped football because of both the cost and America's entry into World War II. They originally started their program in 1900 and joined the Missouri Valley Conference in 1928 after the big schools separated to start the Big Six. They only ever won 3 conference championships in 1925, and then in 1927 in the North Central Conference, and finally 1936 in the Missouri Valley. They had an all-time record of 187, 143, and 28. They finished their final year at 5-4, going 1-4 in the MWC. Their final game would be against Loyola in Los Angeles, and it was canceled because of restrictions on travel during World War II. Just like Gonzaga, after the season in 1942, Creighton's athletic director David Shine announced that the basketball and football teams would be put on hiatus, mostly because of the uncertainty surrounding the military draft and how many potential students and players they would lose to the front lines. The weight rooms and athletics equipment had even been sent to military training camps to be used by future soldiers. Once the war ended in 1945, basketball returned and football didn't. There have been a handful of attempts to restart football at Creighton, but none of them have worked. Aside from a silly year in the 1980s where a bunch of Creighton newspaper students pretended the Blue Jays had a team and reported on fake games, there hasn't been much traction. This actually was a super funny story. There hasn't been any football played on Creighton's campus, and at this point, with Creighton playing in the Big East Conference, it'd be too expensive to start a football program from scratch and try to have them play as a football-only member in another conference in the FCS. It's easier and cheaper for them to not start a program right now. Also, another interesting note is that most of these schools seem to be Catholic schools. Xavier is another interesting story, as they're located in Cincinnati, and they restarted their football program after World War II, only to have it shut down again in the 70s. It started in 1900 as an independent, and would stay independent during both of its runs. When World War II came up, the team paused its season in 1943, and returned to play in 1946. They ended up going 10-1 in 1949, and beat Arizona State in the Salad Bowl, which was their only bowl appearance. In 1951, the teams went 9-0-1, but once it got into the 60s and 70s, the team got worse and worse. This was to the point where they were only winning 1 or 2 games a year in the 70s. That, combined with rising cost of keeping the football program running, led the university's president to make the decision to disband the team after 1973. They finished with an all-time record of 302, 222, and 22. They did keep a relatively competitive club football team for a long time, but it went away in 2013 and is just now finally restarting this year. As for scholarship football, it doesn't look like that'll ever be a possibility anytime soon. Xavier wants to keep their focus on becoming a better university and is redirecting their funding instead of restarting a football program, especially with Cincinnati right across from town being a tough team to recruit against and the cost of starting a football program from scratch only getting higher. Okay, so now that we're halfway through the video, be sure to let me know another school that doesn't have football I could include in part 2, and what other topic I could cover next. The next school we're to talk about is once again a Catholic school, and that is the St. Louis Billikens. St. Louis is different. Their first season was in 1899, and they're actually one of the most important schools in football history because they were the first team to throw the forward pass in 1906 and actually competed at the Olympics in 1904. They were independents from 1899 to 1936 and were actually a really competitive football team during that time frame. They went undefeated in 1901, 1904, and 1906, but don't claim any national titles. They joined the Missouri Valley in 1937 and took an independent year in 1940 before returning to the conference the next season. They only sat out 1943 and 44 for World War II before coming back to the program in 1945, but they struggled. They went 2-6 in 1949, and then they ended their football program. In total, the Billikens went 82, 78, and 13. This wasn't officially the last of Billiken football, though, since the university had actually sponsored a club football team in the 60s and 70s. With the gridiron football being gone, the university poured their extra assets into another football team, and their soccer program has won a total of 10 national championships from 1959 to 1973. Since 2005, they've been a member of the Atlantic 10 Conference, and it's weird a team in Missouri is in the A10, but it also makes it really hard for the team to restart a football program if they want to, because it would probably mean they would have to move conferences. With the Rams gone and the Battlehawks doing really well in the UFL, I think the Billikens would get a lot of homegrown fans if they were to restart a program, but they don't have any plans to do so right now, and the costs are once again just too high. What we're to talk about is Grand Canyon, and it's completely different compared to any other schools on this list because of how different Grand Canyon is as a university compared to the other schools. Located in Phoenix, Arizona, and just about ready to move to the Mountain West Conference, Grand Canyon would have a pretty strong recruiting base and compete well in the Mountain West, but there are a few problems in its way. For starters, Grand Canyon is not only a private university, but it's also a for-profit university and one of the only ones in the entire country. It started out as a small NAIA nonprofit, but got way bigger once it became for-profit. It's one of the fastest growing universities in the NCAA, but has failed to return to being a nonprofit since being bought out by a company. Essentially, the university is run by a company that gives out diplomas and also fields sports teams. It's really unique in that regard, and it's gotten in a lot of trouble a few times because of it. Until it returns to nonprofit status, it's really hard to keep money in the right places, so adding football before then would just be way too expensive, but it's also really hard to do legally. Their athletic director, Brian Mueller, understands that. He also understands how expensive it would be. With Title IX issues, you've got to build a 50,000 seat arena or stadium, and you're really going to lose money for 10 to 15 years, and you have to get that money someplace else. You have to eliminate so much else. Grand Canyon would rather keep their good basketball program than redirect money into starting football that could tank their success in other places. And honestly, to me, it makes sense. Okay, so our final school is going to be the St. Peter's Peacocks. No, they're honestly not that high profile, but a couple of years ago they had a huge March Madness run, so let's go ahead and throw them in there for fun at the end. Some of you guys might obviously remember that crazy run they had in 2022 when they made it to the Elite Eight after a few crazy upsets. But what you might not know is they actually had a football program until fairly recently in 2006. Like their basketball team, they played in the Metro Atlantic Athletic Conference, and they'd actually played there from 1971 to 2006. The football team was a late addition, having been created nearly 100 years after the university was founded. But in a place like Jersey City, St. Peter's had the capability of being a pretty good team, since a lot of good football players come from New Jersey and Pennsylvania. But in those 30 years that the team had competed, it was not good. It had 2 seasons in 1984 and 1988 where it just literally didn't compete as an FCS school because it didn't have enough players on its roster. It ended up starting out at the D3 level, but moved to the FCS in 1991 with the rest of the athletics programs at St. Peter's. But since the move, they ended up going 38-103. They had only 47 players on the roster for their last year, and their AD Bill Stein said, quote, "It was a very tough decision, but it was the right one." Over time, other teams in the MAAC stopped sponsoring football programs, and St. Peter's was just one of the last ones in the league to do so. The fact they didn't have an on-campus stadium was also tough. They were literally borrowing Jersey City's main field, and the city wouldn't let them play on any other day other than Thursday or Saturday, making scheduling difficult. The Peacocks stopped playing football not long after because it was too expensive, and because they were awful and never had enough players. They never looked back, and seemingly put all their eggs into having that 2022 basketball run, which we will always all remember. So yeah, today we talked about 8 high-profile schools that don't have football, and what happened to them, their history, and if they had any hope of coming back. It looks like pretty much none of them have any future in coming back due to various reasons, mostly cost and conference-wise, but maybe they will. But what do you guys think? What was the most interesting of these 8 schools? Who is another school that doesn't have football I should cover next? And what other topic should I do on the channel? I really enjoy these type of videos, but before you go, don't forget to also leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and check out my other videos on the end screen, including how every single FBS expansion team has done since 2010. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.